Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Tinatin Japaridze, an analyst with Eurasia Group. Tinatin, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me back, Brittany.
There has been a lot of fluidity, a lot of movement in recent days when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine peace deal being brokered by the United States. So just a few days ago, President Trump, he proposed a 28-point peace plan, and this was roundly criticized as being Russia's wish list. There were some concessions in there that Ukraine has previously said were non-starters. Now, after negotiations between Ukrainian and U.S. officials, Ukraine has reportedly agreed to what has been characterized as the core terms of the new peace plan. So to start off the conversation, what are your thoughts on the metamorphosis of this proposal?
Yes, absolutely, Brittany. And it's still very much a fluid process and a living document, as we all know. So all of this is still very much evolving at the moment. In terms of how the peace proposal in its current form originated, so based on what we know at this stage, the proposal originated as a U.S. drafted framework that was shaped largely by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and his outreach to Moscow. And those early drafts, as you noted, Brittany, leaned noticeably toward Russian preferences, especially on territorial recognition and Ukrainian neutrality, which were certainly going to be non-starters for Kiev. And both Europe and Ukraine were largely excluded from that process early on. And only after leaked drafts appeared in the media, they understandably scrambled to get back into the process. So right before the Geneva talks over the weekend, European governments reportedly sent amendments to Kiev, not a separate counter proposal, as some have sort of talked about the 19-point deal, but despite the fact that the initial terms were non-starters, it looks like both the Europeans and the Ukrainians are a little bit more comfortable with what is being worked on at the moment. And in Geneva, Ukraine incorporated many of those points to produce a coordinated US-Ukraine E3, which is essentially France, Germany, UK position. And in the revised plan that is currently sitting on President Trump's desk, that is waiting for his approval before anything is formally presented to Moscow, it sounds like for the time being, Kiev is more willing to engage with what is presently being prepped. Now, what we're not so sure about, and I'm very skeptical, is whether the current draft is going to be acceptable to Moscow, given that it's quite a departure from what they were working on with the US with the 28-point peace plan.
I want to talk about that because when it came to the 28-point peace plan, Putin said that that could, quote, serve as the basis for a final peace settlement. Obviously, it was a non-starter for Kyiv. Then this new plan's hammered out. Kyiv says this is something that Ukraine can work with. Some small details need to be tinkered with. Some things need to be hammered out. But we can go with this. Because Ukraine can go with this, does that mean Russia won't?
Yes, because at the end of the day, both have to be comfortable with what's on the table and on a piece of paper for it to be acceptable to both sides. Now, what really jumped out in this modified version of the plan, even though it hasn't been publicized yet, but based on what we know, is how dramatically Europe and Ukraine have reshaped its most contentious provisions. So we're talking about major changes that now include reportedly increased sort of push on the Ukrainian side to allow Ukraine to essentially maintain its sovereignty. So we're talking about increasing the allowed size of Ukraine's army by 200,000 troops, softening the previously strict ban on NATO membership, strengthening US Article 5-like security guarantees for Kiev, removing Russian-demanded provisions on denazification of Ukraine, and deleting explicit territorial concessions and shifting negotiations to begin from the current contact line rather than recognizing Russian annexations, which is something that Russia has been pushing for. So I think that we are going to continue seeing this push and pull from the Russian side, but also from the Ukrainian side in terms of both sides getting what it is that they've been pushing for from essentially day one, because Russia has had its maximalist demands that they were trying to push from the very, very beginning. And I don't think that it's likely that we're going to see any major concessions on the Russian side. The only way that that would happen is, one, if Russia were to start losing territory in terms of what they've already annexed and have gained over the past months, or if there were very, very significant US sanctions that they were getting increasingly worried about. Now, I think one of the main reasons that we're seeing Russia back at the table is because of the recent sanctions on the Russian energy that you and I discussed last time. So clearly that is having effect.
And for months and months now, we have seen this real feet dragging from Putin to getting to the negotiating table. Last month, you called it a new stalemate in diplomacy. And you said that battleground developments, you said it now, you said it last month, will dictate if and when Putin comes to the table. And last month, Zelensky said to NBC, we're not losing this war, and Russia certainly isn't winning right now. What is the state of the battlefield right now? And, is that any indication that Putin's going to get to the table, or that's going to incentivize him to reach and hammer out an agreement anytime soon?
Well, I don't think that Putin is losing in this war at the moment, to be perfectly frank. In fact, what we've talked about in the past was issues that Ukraine has been having in terms of manpower deficits, and that unfortunately continues to be the case. Meanwhile, we've seen some territorial gains from the Russian side, nothing that is necessarily monumental, but still they keep on grinding on the Russian side. So that is why I think that we are unlikely to see a more desperate Putin necessarily, that is going to be very willing to come to the table to accept both concessions that essentially the Trump administration is hoping that Putin will agree to, but also any sort of a loss in regards to its position, both politically and diplomatically, as well as in terms of military gains that the Russians still hope they will be able to clinch between now and the next few months, which certainly makes it less likely that we are going to see a major ceasefire anytime soon. I think there may be some progress compared to what we were seeing even a couple of weeks ago, but even so, I'm not expecting any miracles for the time being. I think you are absolutely right that through all of this, one thing remains constant, and this is battlefield developments that we're observing. We always stress this point in our conversations because ultimately what happens on the battleground shapes what's possible at the table. And at this stage, what is important for Ukraine is that US weapons and intelligence support for Kyiv are expected to continue. And that support is absolutely vital for Kyiv.
And I know that you don't think Putin's desperate enough to get to the table and really negotiate in good faith. But what about Zelensky? Because to that point about U.S. support, reportedly a few days ago, the United States said that it would cut off support to Ukraine should they not reach a peace deal by Thanksgiving. Obviously, Thanksgiving's in just a few days. You don't think a peace deal is going to be hammered out by then. What's the likelihood, do you think, of this proposal or a proposal being reached?
So it's absolutely off the table at this point, and I think the Trump administration is accepting this reality that clinching a deal by Thanksgiving is not going to happen. So that timeline, or rather the deadline, was relaxed in favor of maintaining diplomatic momentum. The Ukrainian side hopes that President Zelensky will be able to visit the United States, perhaps as early as this week or maybe next week, to meet with President Trump and realign with Washington. Meanwhile, we are likely to see more meetings between the Russian and the US sides, potentially even in Abu Dhabi, another round of talks. So all of that is, of course, going to take time. And the Trump administration understands that trying to lock something in over the next few days is not going to be realistic. In fact, if there's too much pressure on either side, on either Moscow or Kyiv, that could essentially turn out to be counterproductive for Washington. So I think they're being a little bit cautious. Yes, there's pressure, but there's a healthy dose of pressure on both sides right now. We are probably going to see more US, Ukraine, European coordination to lock in a common negotiating stance over the coming days, alongside continued US Russia talks, because obviously there are some back channels as well that are still very active. And I do expect ultimately Moscow to stick to its familiar playbook, pushing for more territorial concessions from Kiev before agreeing to any leader level meeting between the Russian and the US sides, let alone Russian and Ukrainian sides. So Ukraine and Europe will keep pressing Washington to ensure that the plan does not drift away from Kiev's core interests. And through all of this, it will also be very important, and I emphasize this one more time, for us to keep an eye on what's actually happening on the battlefield, because ultimately that will be the barometer primarily for Putin, but also for President Zelensky. I think the one thing that he cannot afford to do, just given his own standing at home, is to make any promises and any pledges in terms of giving up territory to Russia. I think that is completely out of the question for the time being, even if Washington continues to pressure him to realistically assess what's happening and therefore understand that there are certain things that are no longer really on the table, such as, for example, getting Crimea back anytime soon in the foreseeable future. But Zelensky will have to be very careful.
President Trump, he wanted to wrap this war up fast, and he's mused publicly, hey, I thought this was going to be the easiest deal to get done. I have a good relationship with Putin. It's proving more difficult, essentially, than what I thought. Why do you think that is? Do you think the Trump administration doesn't have their eye on the battlefield? Do you think they're miscalculating Putin at all? Do you think they need to loop in Europe more? I mean, why can't this deal get done?
I think the biggest problem here is not even the United States or Europe, but rather it's Moscow. The Russian side is so focused on their maximalist demands. There is absolutely no way that anyone in Putin's circle is going to be able to take that risk back home and go against what the big boss has been telling them all along. And that is, these are the demands. We went into Ukraine with these demands, and we are not going to be backing down. And that is very, very clear. So instead of trying to convince President Zelensky, I think it's ultimately going to be all about convincing President Putin that he needs this deal. And no matter how much pressure is currently on Vladimir Putin, I don't think that he is really in a position right now, in terms of either carrots or sticks, for him to be willing to even entertain the idea of showing his own constituents, not just the West, but his own constituents in Russia, that all of this that transpired since February of 2022 was essentially in vain, because there were many lives lost. A lot of Russians are uncomfortable, no matter what they say publicly, in terms of what has transpired since the war started. And there are still some, according to polls, and in fact, many who want the war to end. They are tired of everything that has been going on over the last few years, and they want this to come to some sort of a logical conclusion. But no matter what, Putin has to eventually, when the war ends, he has to show that he was able to get something that he didn't have prior to February 2022. And that is going to be tricky. But for the time being, having some sort of a consensus on the US, European, and Ukrainian side, and being on the same table, realigning, will be extremely important to show unity to Putin, because otherwise he will just keep on grinding.
And I know that this war has been dragging on for almost 4 years now, and I don't want to simplify it. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but you're saying Putin's not going to come to the table unless something seriously changes in the favor of Ukraine on the battlefield, or if he's really feeling it when it comes to the economy. So is the solution here turn up significantly the heat when it comes to economic sanctions, and or really boost up military aid to Ukraine? I mean, are those the only two solutions, do you think, for the United States to try to help, as well as the rest of Europe?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it is precisely that combination, Brittany, as you well pointed out, because just having one or the other is not going to accelerate and expedite this process. It'll have to be both components that ultimately push Putin, because if it's either or, he will still find excuses and he will still find some holes in the system to be able to keep going, because for the time being he can, and for the foreseeable future he is able to sustain his efforts on the battlefield, contrary to what we're seeing, unfortunately, on the Ukrainian side, because there are some limitations there. So Putin is certainly aware of this, and as soon as he sees that there is more of a commitment on the US side, which was not necessarily the case with the incoming Trump 2.0 administration, but now it's increasingly likely that that support, the military support and intel support, is not going to be going away for Kiev from the American side. I think that is likelier to make Putin think a little bit harder about at what point is he going to have to back down, even if it's not anything significant, but just to show that he is being reasonable, that he is someone that the United States and the Europeans can talk to. Because at the moment and over the past few years, essentially the West has been banging its head against the wall trying to figure out how can we break through and get through to him. And I don't think that we are there yet. It will take significant sanctions, significant pain when it comes to the Russian economy, and a more of a reassurance for Ukraine that they will have the resources they need to keep on going much longer than Putin hopes Ukraine can keep going for the Russian side to understand that they're going to have to back down on some of those maximalist demands.
And another common theme of our conversations is that Russia is not exactly hurtling towards peace. And so I think that means that you and I have a lot more conversations in store as we see significant developments come out of this war. Tinatin, I always appreciate your expertise, your insight. Thank you so much. And until next time.
Thank you so much, Brittany.